Hi, I'm Ron Fink from The Deal. I'm here with David Rosewater from Morgan Stanley. We're at the Deal's Corporate Governance Conference, and we're going to discuss governance and activism and best practices for the next few minutes. David, let me start by asking you what you think are the biggest red flags these days at boards and their governance practices for activists.
Well, I think that traditionally activists are looking for a lot of different things, but the thing that probably attracts their attention the most is relationships among directors outside of the boardroom. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you have a group of directors that are all members of the same country club, or they have seats on other boards together, or they have other financial relationships among each other, other business relationships amongst each other. Those kinds of things, in my experience, make an activist look and say, okay, are the directors making decisions that are in their best interests, mm-hmm. or are they in the best interests of the CEO or the other directors? Mm-hmm. And it's particularly exacerbated if the CEO is at the center of all those relationships, as you might imagine.
Right. Goes without saying that underperformance is probably the first red flag, but then I suppose this is the sort of thing that will then, draw them most quickly to a situation.
Sure. Well, I guess if you're talking about governance red flags, red flags at the board, it's something like I described.
Right.
If you're talking about what draws an activist into a situation to take it on, mm-hmm. ultimately it's really about, for financial activists at all, ultimately it's about value and the stock price. Mm-hmm. So unless they can find a lever that they believe that the company can pull in order to drive the stock's value over some period of time, mm-hmm. They're unlikely to look at a situation. Now, what kinds of levers are there?
Well, you mentioned conflicts as being one.
Well,
perhaps.
Conflicts is really those are the kinds of things that an activist looks at as a red flag for poor governance, mm-hmm. and something that they can use against the company, and something that may be driving poor performance. Mm-hmm. But they're not going to come into a situation unless they see a way for that poor performance essentially to turn around.
Right.
So what do they look for? They look for the kinds of value drivers people probably would expect. An ability to sell the company, an ability for the company to be worth greater than the sum of its parts, whether that's breaking up the company into different pieces, whether that's selling off individual non-core assets, mm-hmm. things like that. They'll look for opportunities to return cash or suboptimal capital structure,
right.
a lazy balance sheet,
right.
an opportunity to use that balance sheet to return more cash, mm-hmm. To drive returns. And then also, particularly in the last 6-7 years, you've seen the development of what I call operational activism.
Right.
So looking at the actual performance of the company at a more granular level. Mm-hmm. What kind of margins do they have? What kind of ROIC do they have? What are they using their money for? Are they, what does their SG&A look like? All those kinds of issues, of course, interrelated with each other. And if they can find one of those fundamentally four things, maybe a fifth if you count sort of advantages that a company would have in being a platform for rolling up a certain sector.
Right.
Without one of those 4 or 5 things, they're unlikely to go into a situation. The governance on top of it mm-hmm. is something, along with the stock price itself and other factors, are vulnerabilities right. that an activist can use against a company mm-hmm. if they see value that can be had.
Mm-hmm. Other red flags, what about tenure? We were just hearing about a situation where a company had, I think, an average tenure of like 25 years on its board. I'm sure there's no hard and fast rule here for numbers, although I think the average for the S&P 500 is something like 8.3 years.
Yeah, it's about 8.5, that's
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
There's certainly no hard and fast rule. Clearly, long tenured board members are viewed by ISS and the other proxy advisory services as a way to lose the independence that an otherwise independent board member would have. That's really what drives the tenure argument. But beyond that, obviously, the longer they're there, and the reason that people get concerned about independence, the longer they're there, the more there's concern about whether it's about the relationship instead of what's really going on in the business. Are those directors going to be in a position to stand up to somebody who at this point might be their friend? So tenure is certainly an item that activists look at to decide if that governance vulnerability is there, and certainly is a target for activists, and it plays well certainly with some shareholders that particularly, I mean, lots of shareholders, but especially those who focus on governance issues.
How does a board balance, short-term versus long-term objectives when an activist may have, a different incentive structure? I suppose it's, short-term versus long-term is in the eye of the beholder, but it seems like that kind of is the crystallization of a lot of these issues. Basically.
Sure, and often it is.
Yeah.
And it really comes down to how good is the company versus the activist at articulating why it does what it does, why it does not do the things that might look like it makes sense from the outside, but, and convincing the shareholders that what they do and don't do is all about shareholder value. Whether that's, however they define that, typically a company is going to define it somewhat longer term than an activist for sure. And so it's really a matter of trying to lay out for the stockholders and make it clear to them that essentially the board and the management are on their side. Right. And that will often allow the stockholders to give the benefit of the doubt to the board and the management.
And it sounds like it does go back to governance, though, because if you don't have those, those good governance practices at your board, you're not going to be doing that sort of thing in the first place.
I think that's everything is intertwined, right? You have to have a board that's engaged, that is understands the industry, that isn't afraid to stand up to management when it's necessary, but also is able to work with management and to help guide them in the strategy, but also to be able to look at themselves objectively and make decisions that are best for the shareholders and not for themselves.
Great. On that note, I thank you, David, for
Terrific.
For joining.
Thanks
us.
for having me.